A laboratory in Pennsylvania just finished comparing the DNA of 36 people who were buried together with care in the heart of colonial Charleston. They were dressed for burial, some wrapped in shrouds, some laid to rest with personal belongings beside them. Men, women, and children interred one after another across 3 decades by people who clearly loved them enough to do it properly and to keep doing it properly for 30 years running. Every visible sign said the same thing. This was a family plot, a community taking care of its own. Then the lab ran the comparison. The researchers are not calling what came back a disappointment. They are calling it the discovery. Stay with me, because what the DNA found inside that cemetery says more about what slavery actually did to black families in America than almost anything written down in a book. Here's the thing about a port city built on treating human beings as cargo. Charleston, South Carolina was, for most of the 18th century, the single busiest point of entry for the transatlantic slave trade anywhere in North America. Historians estimate that roughly 40% of every enslaved African brought into Britain's American colonies came through this one harbor. Ships anchored off Sullivan's Island at the harbor's mouth, where captives were held in quarantine, sometimes 10 days, sometimes far longer. Inside structures the historical record calls, without any softening, pest houses. Once cleared, they were rowed across the water into the city and sold at auction on streets that are still there today, under names that are still on the map. If you are black and American, the odds that you have an ancestor who passed through that one harbor are close to 1 in 2. By 1730, enslaved people already outnumbered white residents in South Carolina, roughly 2 to 1. By 1860, more than 70% of Charleston's population was enslaved. The entire economy that built the city's famous townhouses, rice, indigo, the fortunes made and remade for a century and a half, ran on a labor force the law refused to recognize as people, and refused, just as deliberately, to let keep any record of who was related to whom. That refusal was not passive, it was policy, and it was routine business practice. An enslaved man, woman, or child was collateral. A debt could be settled by selling a spouse to one buyer and the children to another in the same afternoon at the same auction block, without a single law in South Carolina requiring the sale to consider the family at all. It happened often enough that it did not require cruelty as a special ingredient. It only required an estate that needed dividing, or an owner who needed cash. That is the world the 36 people buried on Anson Street came out of. Nobody knew they were there until 2013, when a construction crew renovating Charleston's Gaillard Performing Arts Center hit something in the ground that was not supposed to be there. Archaeologists led by Dr. Eric Poplin of the firm Brockington and Associates were called in immediately. What they found over the following weeks stopped the project cold. Dozens of intact burials laid out in the careful, ordered rows of an actual cemetery, not the disorganized scatter you get from a mass grave or a hurried disposal. 36 individuals in total, adults and children, eventually dated to somewhere between the 1760s and the 1790s based on the coffin hardware and burial style. There was no historical marker on that ground, no church record, no deed anywhere in Charleston's unusually well-kept archives that acknowledged a cemetery existed on that patch of land. The city had simply built over it, the way it had built over so much else, and moved on with its business. The people who found them gave them a name before anyone knew a single fact about their individual lives. They called them, collectively, the ancestors, solving even the most basic questions about the ancestors, who they were, where they had come from, whether they were even related to one another, required going further than any surviving paperwork could take a historian. It required going into the bones themselves, using 2 separate scientific methods that each answer a completely different question. The first is isotope analysis, and it works on a principle that is almost eerie once you understand it. The water a person drinks and the food a person eats as a child leaves a chemical signature, a specific ratio of the element strontium, locked permanently into the enamel of their teeth as those teeth form. That signature reflects the underlying geology of wherever the child was living at the time. It does not change later in life. It cannot be altered by anything that happens afterward. A tooth that finished forming on the coast of West Africa carries West Africa's chemical signature for as long as that tooth exists, even if the person who owned it went on to spend the next 40 years in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Researchers tested the enamel of the Anson Street Ancestors and found that at least 6 of them carried signatures features inconsistent with a Carolina childhood and consistent instead with growing up an ocean away in West or West Central Africa. 6 people, at minimum, who survived the Middle Passage as children or young adults lived out the remainder of their lives in Charleston and were eventually laid to rest there by a community that had known them. The second method is ancient DNA, and it answers a different question entirely, not where you grew up, who you are related to, and how closely. Scientists extracted genetic material from the densest, best-preserved parts of each skeleton, the petrous bone at the base of the skull, individual teeth, and small bones from the hands and feet. The work happened in 2 phases, roughly a decade apart. An initial study sequenced whole mitochondrial genomes, the DNA passed down only through the maternal line, and confirmed African ancestry across the group. A far more demanding second study, published in 2023, went after nuclear DNA, the genetic material that can reveal a full genetic profile and, critically, can be compared person to person to detect actual family relationships. Usable genome-wide data came back from a majority of the 36. The ancestry those genomes pointed to was not a single place. It was a spread across Western and West Central Africa. Different regions, different peoples, different points of origin, all converging on the same patch of ground in Charleston. One individual's genetic profile aligned specifically with the Fulani people, a population historically spread across the West African Sahel, thousands of miles from the coast where most captives were loaded onto ships. 36 people, at least 6 confirmed to have crossed an ocean as children. Dozens of possible family pairings tested against one another, looking for anyone who belonged to anyone else. Do the arithmetic on what came back before I tell you. The team that finally made this possible did not start in a laboratory. It started with one man refusing to let the county quietly move on. Dr. Ade Ofunian was a cultural anthropologist based in Charleston, and in 2013, the same year the ancestors were found, he founded an organization called the Gaillard Society for the specific purpose of making sure their story would not simply be logged, boxed, and forgotten the way so many discoveries like it have been. He spent the next several years building something that almost never happens in American archaeology, a research process where the descendant community, not the university and not the city, set the terms of what would happen next. Starting in 2017, the Gaillard Society held a series of public gatherings called community conversations. The question on the table was never a scientific one. It was, what do we, as a community, believe should happen to these people now that we have found them? The answers shaped everything that followed. The community decided the ancestors should be reburied, not kept indefinitely in boxes or put on display. The community decided the genetic research should happen alongside them, not instead of them, or without their say. Gullah Geechee tradition holds that the dead are never truly abandoned, that a burial ground remains sacred with or without a deed to prove it, and that a proper death is not an ending, but what the culture calls a homegoing, a release, and a return. That belief ran through every decision the community made about the ancestors, long before a single genome had been sequenced. And in one of those conversations, it was school children, not the historians in the room, not the geneticists, who raised the idea that stayed with everyone present, that the ancestors should not go back into the ground nameless a second time, that before they were reburied, they deserved to be given names. If this is the kind of history that belongs to your family and your community, subscribe now, because the next burial ground in this series is already in production. Here is the verdict: the DNA actually returned, and it is worth sitting with. Researchers compared genetic material across the individuals buried at Anson Street, checking every pairing the data would allow for a family relationship, parent to child, sibling to sibling, grandparent to grandchild. Of all of those comparisons, exactly one came back positive: a single mother and her child. Every other pairing among those 36 people, buried together in ordered rows, clearly by people who returned to that ground again and again for 30 years to bury the next one beside the last, came back negative. Not distant cousins, not half-siblings, strangers in the genetic sense, resting side by side for 250 years. The research team was careful about what they claimed and what they did not. Genomic coverage on several individuals was thin. Some samples yielded only a small fraction of a usable genome, which means additional distant relationships could exist that the current data is simply not sensitive enough to detect. This is not being presented as a final word. It is the most complete complete word anyone has produced so far, and the team has said plainly that more individuals and more refined data remain to be studied. There is one more thing the researchers could not find, despite years of looking: a single document that names any of these 36 people, or explicitly records that they were enslaved. What they have instead is the location itself. The burial ground sat far from the parts of Charleston where the city's free black community is known to have buried its dead, and on land that belonged, at the time, to white property owners. That pattern does not carry the certainty of a signed record, but it is the kind of evidence historians take seriously, and it points in only one direction. On April 27, 2019, the ancestors were given names. The ceremony followed Yoruba tradition, led by Natalie Washington White, a Yoruba Orisa Osun priestess and African historian. One by one, honorary African and Gula Geechee names were conferred on all 36 individuals, names chosen to restore an identity and a dignity that had been taken from them twice, once in life by a system that recorded people as property, and once again by 2.5 centuries of silence afterward. Two of the men, the ones whose tooth enamel had confirmed they were born in Africa, were given the names Daba and Ganda. Those are the names researchers use for them now, in the published science itself, instead of a burial number on a site map. A week later, on May 4, 2019, Charleston laid the ancestors to rest for the second time. It was not a quiet ceremony. A horse-drawn hearse carried the remains in procession down George Street, the same part of the city where, 2.5 centuries earlier, enslaved people had once been marched toward auction. There was drumming, singing, dancing. Community members wrote personal messages and placed them inside the vault alongside the remains. It was built deliberately as a homegoing, a ritual meant to send the ancestors back properly, the way their own traditions would have done it the first time, if anyone had been allowed to. Dr. Ad Ofunian loaded the remains onto the hearse himself. At the vault, he placed them inside with his own hands, several at a time, and read all 36 new names aloud to the crowd that had gathered to listen. He had spent 7 years making sure that single day would happen. He did not get much longer after it. In October of 2020, 17 months after that ceremony, Dr. Ofunian died suddenly, following a health crisis, at the age of 67. He never saw the full genomic study published. That paper came out in January of 2023 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, more than 2 years after he was gone, confirming in hard genetic data exactly what the years of community conversations had already sensed without needing a laboratory to say it, that the people in that ground had come from across an ocean, from different regions and different peoples, and had ended up, nearly all of them, as strangers to one another by blood. Charleston is still building the permanent memorial for the site. An artist was selected in 2023. Construction is not finished. 40% of the enslaved Africans brought to this country passed through that one harbor, which means that somewhere inside a very large number of Black American families alive today, there is a version of this exact story sitting unresolved. A person who survived that crossing, who ended up in a graveyard nobody wrote down, waiting on a laboratory and a community determined enough to ask the right question about who they were. The lab found that almost none of the 36 people buried on Anson Street were related to each other by blood, but that was never really the point of the cemetery. Whoever buried them, dressed them, wrapped them, laid them in careful, ordered rows, and returned again and again over 30 years to bury the next one beside the last, was not waiting on a DNA test to decide who counted as family. They had already decided. Long before science could confirm it either way, they had already chosen each other. And in 2019, for one weekend in May, Charleston finally decided the same thing. 36 strangers by blood, ancestors by choice, named at last and carried home.